Well, in 1775, the hostilities heated up, to say the least. Washington had some problems because he didn't have a well oiled, trained military at all. He had a lot of tough guys ready to volunteer, and he needed them, but he had to wage a different kind of war. At that time, the only way you could really do a good job, because of the kind of weapon they were using, the primary weapon on a battlefield was a cannon, but the muskets weren't that accurate. They were smooth bore, and they had to line up shoulder to shoulder as tight as they could get, and they would fire a whole volume at once. Somebody's going to hit something. And then they drop to the knee and start loading. They're muzzle loaders. And the second rank behind steps through the first rank, and they fire a volley and drop to their knee. And the third rank steps through the first two, and they fire a volley and drop to the knee. So it's just boom, 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 boom. They just walk right through the enemy. That was their way of doing business. They had cannon. Cannon were the big ones because they could take out a company in one go. And there were all kinds of different kinds of projectiles built into the cannon, from grape shot, which was just anything they could put in there, to balls that would take out a ship. The technology was primitive. In today's world, we would laugh at it, but in those worlds, it was brutal. It was just brutal. And we didn't have the kind of army that could do that very effectively, so Washington had to conserve them and use them in a guerrilla manner. And he did as much as he could that way. Well, one of the first things he did, armies have to be fed. They have to be resupplied. It's the supply department that wins wars, not the generals. The generals win battles, but it's the quartermaster that always determines the outcome of a war. It always has been. And he had to cut off their supply the best he could. So there happened to be a guy hiding out in the colonies named John Paul. He had been a merchant marine captain. He was kind of a tough sort of a guy, and he had gotten annoyed at some seaman and ran him through with a sword. And there was a pending court-martial over that in the British merchant marine. So he was kind of hiding out in the colonies. We gave him the name Jones at the end, but he was really John Paul of Scotland. And he was asked if he couldn't do something about disrupting these attempts to supply the redcoats on our shores. Well, he did a marvelous job. First thing he did was go to a tavern, sit down and find out how many tough guys he could round up, and he created the Marine Corps. So on November 10th of 1775, the oldest military service began officially in Tunn's Tavern. And the way he did that was he would take a merchant ship that was fast, like a schooner, and he could outsail these big, heavy ships of the line with 30 cannon on board. And he would run up on the side, throw grappling hooks, tie the ships together, and his Marines would run across the deck with cutlasses and go hand to hand with the crew. He didn't stand there and throw cannonballs at them. He didn't have a warship. He just stormed the decks. Later, he put firing platforms in the rigging, and he had musketeers up there. To keep from shooting his own men, they put a big X on the top of their hats so they could tell their people from the enemy. Officers in the Marine Corps today still have that cross on the top of their hats. The Marine Corps became kind of famous at that time, even though they were a little outfit. And the Army, of course, was doing the best they could in various different fronts. But Washington could never have won the war. It was just impossible odds. These colonies were not working as a team. He wasn't getting supplied like he should have. It was a doomsday thing. He had to have foreign help, and he had it. Marquis de Lafayette at his elbow, a young man, very high aristocrat in the French culture, and he had the ear of Louis XVI. All the uniforms and muskets and powder and cannon came from the French. So what we really had for Revolutionary War was France fighting England again, using Washington. And he had a chance that way, but still it was impossible. At the end, there was just no way he could possibly do it. And everybody knew it. So the French decided to enter the war, and they did. They landed their troops north of Boston on the shore. They traveled overland to Yorktown. Washington became a junior officer under the French command, and they fought the Battle of Yorktown for us, and they defeated the British there because Cornwallis was trying to get resupplied. The ships can get in there next to Yorktown, and he was waiting for these ships. And he was mad that he was fighting British subjects anyway. He wrote lots of letters. They're interesting to read. I recommend anytime you get a chance, read what Cornwallis was writing to Parliament during that war. For British soldiers to fire on British subjects is an abomination. I'm a military man, and I will obey my orders, but not 1 inch beyond the letter of those orders. He hated the fact that he was fighting against his own people. He respected Washington. They were both Masons in the same lodge. It was a field lodge, but nevertheless, they knew each other well. Cornwallis wanted an honorable way to stop. And when they showed up in that kind of force and he was pinned against the water, he quickly raised the flag and it was over. The hostilities had stopped. Well, all during this war, starting with the Declaration of Independence, our founding fathers were busy. They weren't sitting at home hiding out. They had designed this Declaration of Independence, which made each colony that had been chartered separately into a nation by itself. There were 13 nations involved. So all summer on 1776, they ran up and down the coast ratifying a couple of documents that finally did mature in September of 1776, and one was the Union Trust. It was like a holding company. They called it the United Estates. It had been United Colonies. Well, now it's the United Estates. Well, they dropped the E and it became United States. And they created the Federation. Now, there's a difference between federations and confederations. A federation is tough. You're in that, you're in. You can't get out without the others agreeing to it. So the war was on. They weren't working as a team even then, and they were struggling trying to figure out a way out. They decided around 1781, the war wasn't even over, to create an arrangement where they would work in business together, like a unified front for business. They created a confederation. Now that's much looser. You come and go as you like there. You're there for your own benefit. If it isn't for you, you can leave. Nobody cares. I think a farmers' union is similar to a confederation where everybody works together for the benefit of all, but you don't have to belong and you don't have to stay. You can stay if you want to. It's up to you. The Confederation of American States was formed 1781. It involved the whole thing, all the states. And it worked fine. It was a business front, and that's kind of important. But we really didn't have a constitution. We were still finishing up the war that year. In the end of 81, we finally got the war shut down, and it was a couple of years later before we signed a peace treaty in Paris. Okay, who are the actors? Well, we had 5 people sent, but only 3 made it. One got arrested because he didn't have right credentials, and the English didn't know who he was, so they threw him in jail. Jefferson was supposed to go, but his wife died. Well, he had to stay back for that, so he missed the signing of the peace treaty. He got there shortly after, however, and spent some time in Paris studying law and history and getting himself more knowledgeable about what this was all about. Because we were dealing with nations that were kingdoms. And kingdoms had learned a long time ago to use a straw man with which to do business. That goes back to the Phoenicians, if you want to look at that. Ships on the Sea of the Mediterranean fighting over each other's cargo and battling and causing damage and therefore reaction and debts to pay. Because if you're a businessman and you're shipping expensive goods on a ship and then some other nation takes the goods off the ship, then you're going to have a claim against the shipping company, which may be a king. And they didn't want to have to pay the bill. So they commissioned all these ships. They've been doing that since Rhodes. That means they're incorporated. And the captain is the CEO of the corporation. So he has the power of a king when he's on the high sea. He can kill people, execution. He can marry people. He has all kinds of orders that he can follow. Over the years, different countries would align with each other, make an agreement, a treaty or something to support each other's sea lanes and try to protect their merchant ships from any attack. The Knights Templar were very vicious on the Mediterranean. They had armed cargo ships and they took everybody's cargo. The Jolly Roger was their flag. When they were finally dismissed and removed in, I believe it's 1307, on Friday the 13th, these people became pirates. And the pirate flag became actually pirate flag. But they started out as the Templar Knights. Very high-level people. This business of losing cargo and having a loss means that if you incorporate, and that's a structure that was kind of unique, then it's the corporation, a legal fiction, that's actually the one responsible. And if you just dissolve the corporation and it's not there anymore, there's no bill to pay. So you can avoid responsibility. And kings love that. So everybody made a straw man, front man, an incorporated version of themselves. And all the ships at sea flying their flag did the same thing. So here we have incorporation, a legal fiction process that has to have somebody oversee the whole thing. And they elected somebody to do just that. The trustee of the global estate. Guess who? The Pope. So he's got a church on one hand, and he's got this land thing that he's running on the other hand because he claimed everything on the planet on his behalf. And now he's overseeing the use of incorporated straw men all over the planet. And he's the final guy looking down the nose of all these corporations. If they don't act lawfully, he gets to just remove them. He has the power to erase them with a stroke of a pen. He can do it today, right now. He has that power. And he has an army of people on the planet to do just that. The vicar generals. There's one in every single one of our states. There's one in Portland on East Burnside. He can stop any corporation functioning with the stroke of a pen if he chooses to. Therein lies the problem. There's money to be made, and corruption produces a great deal of money, and the Pope likes to have the money streams. All bankers love that. And that's what was kind of going on throughout the corporate world. Well, when we finally got our treaty signed, and John Paul had been left flapping in the wind. He was never asked to be the father of the American Navy at all at that time. So he went over to Russia and became the father of the Russian Navy. Well, they already had a navy, and the admirals over there didn't like him around much at all, but Catherine the Great loved him. And he went to war against the Turks, and he did a magnificent job for her, so good that eventually he was so highly thought of, they put him in a lead casket, filled it with fine liquor, and buried him, and he's perfectly preserved. He's been exhumed and taken to Annapolis. He's in a rotunda there with all the documents about his work in Russia, all the documents about what he did for us, and now he's, in fact, the father of the American Navy. Oh, yeah. Interesting. So what happens then? They have to sit down and talk how they're going to proceed, that the war's over. And the Treaty of Paris is worded kind of strangely, what George III called the Prince of Peace and all that. And they find that the actual owners of these colonies was a bank under the Pope's direction. And the Lord Mayor of that 1 square mile in London, the city that they call Westminster, where the Bank of England sits, they're kind of the people that own everything. So all of a sudden these treaties take on a little difficulty because here we've been fighting redcoats and they're under the Parliament. They don't own much of anything, but they're trying to become the administrators of law and order. They've been selling their version of the Roman law left from Roman times, from the Roman Curia, all over the planet at the point of a gun. And they call it English law. They had common law all over the world. Everybody had common law. Everybody had a version of it. So we made our own version of it. And that's kind of what the founders were up to. And after kicking this can down the road for a while, they decided to get together with what they had was 12 working drafts of a constitution, because they hadn't even built one of those yet. And they finally narrowed it down to 3. And as I understand it, the 3 were okay for most of the people. Not everybody. They wanted 100%. Madison got busy and took the best parts of all 3 and made the one that they presented in 1787 in the Freedom Hall of Philadelphia. They had a quorum, but they didn't have ratification. And Washington had been faced with a terrible problem. The Army had rebelled twice already. The Marine Corps had protected the capital, New York, from the Army attacking it. They had never been paid. I had a grandfather there. He was a sergeant. None of them had ever been paid. They'd gone through terrible hardship. That means counter-revolution, and every country that does this, they're very well aware of what happens if you don't take care of the Army. So he needed to borrow money. He needed to borrow it yesterday. The Netherlands offered the money. Spain offered money. He had no way of requesting it. Serfs do not talk to kings. There's no communication that way. You have to have a sovereign as the head of state. It has to be done. There was no way out. Washington may have been one of the richest men in the colonies, but he was not a sovereign. There was talk about him becoming a king, so he could be crowned and therefore ask for the money. Some people thought that was a bad idea, including him. Others thought it was a joke. It was no joke. The money was offered under the table, but no one could request it. John Adams to the rescue. John Adams, one of the signatories on the Treaty of Paris, along with Benjamin Franklin and John Jay, all bar attorneys under the crown. They were esquires. They had a foreign title, low-level title, but a title. And John Adams happened to be living next door to this guy Belcher. Remember him? They were neighbors. John knew Belcher was a sovereign. Belcher had never made a big deal of it. More of an annoyance than anything else. Can you help us? Of course he can help us. He sits down with Washington. They knew each other. He's one of the light colonels in Washington's army. He admits he's a sovereign. Yes, he can be the head of state. He has the rank of any king. And he did. Alexander Hamilton had decided, and it's in the Federalist Papers, that those territories that weren't under statehood could be collateral for a loan, and he created the bank to receive the money. Everything was in place, and now Belcher, as head of state, made the request. The money came in. My grandfather received $94 biannually. By that time, he was an old man. But I have the paperwork. It happened. Belcher then did something rather magnificent, and this is the most important part of our American experience. He decided his family had become sovereign due to the fact that the army back in William the Conqueror's time had done a good job, and now he was going to do the same thing for Washington, and he decreed that everyone in the Continental Army from that day forward would be known to be a sovereign. Big deal. And then he took another step. All those born on the land, they'll be born a sovereign. The Constitution reflects that. The President of the Republic must be born on the land. He has to be head of state. It's that simple. I would have loved to have known about this when I was 10 years old. Why is this not in the history books for kids? It's a magnificent story. It's your very roots. Well, The Belchow family's alive and well. They're still with us today. And they've been active, coaching, helping. And on the side, James Clinton Belcher will tell you right now, don't get this sovereign thing, let it go to your head. Sovereigns don't really participate in government. They are kind of above it all. And we have work to do. We have to be citizens. That's a different thing. We have to be citizens of our republic. A different kind of job. So your sovereignty is extended to the land on which you stand. And the nations are sovereign nations. We call them states, but they're independent, sovereign nations bound together in a trust, the Union. They do business through the Confederation of States, the Confederation. So you have about 6 different kinds of documents here, and we've covered 4 of them. So what happened after the first Constitution for the United States of America was finally at least signed in 1787 in Philadelphia, Freedom Hall? It wasn't ratified till almost 1790. There was one guy holding out, Rhode Island. Rhode Island would not ratify. Well, it turned out that they finally got so frustrated with Rhode Island that they ran them down and said, what do you need? Rhode Island's answer was, the individual rights of man must be more clearly identified in this Constitution because even though they are sort of covered inside of the documents, we want it more clearly understood. A Constitution is a contract, and this contract with people has to be more clearly identified, and we got the Bill of Rights. It's been said that the Bill of Rights idea, as they're worded, came out of William Penn's original charter of Pennsylvania. A Native American woman told me that one time. I've never verified it myself, but that would be kind of cute. The Quakers helped us get the Bill of Rights. And it was put in there. Why was it that Rhode Island held out to the very end? They hadn't given up their colonial charter. They were offering safe harbor for pirates and privateers, and they were getting a cut of the booty. It was all about money. They weren't going to give that up without getting something equally valuable in return. We got the Bill of Rights. Between 1790 and 91, it was finally ratified 100%. And in that same period of time, Washington, facing the business of getting the country back on its feet, he had to make a territorial corporation to manage those territories not under statehood. Remember, they were the collateral for the loan anyway. So he created the United States of America. Well, it was a corporation. And it had job to do, including running the Army. The Army comes under that. UCMJ comes under that. And then he had to get trade going between the nations of the world, and they were all kingdoms, and they were all running with straw men, incorporate front men. So France had an incorporated front. Germany had an incorporated front. Everybody did. So he created one too. It's called the United States. And he had a constitution of the United States. Well, that was in fact a commercial corporation, a municipal corporation in the District of Columbia. Well, that was just an area, 100 square miles actually, that Washington himself had surveyed for political discourse, but it was just a district. And this new corporation had the job of running the merchant marine, engaging in trade between nations. We call it commerce, legally. And all these treaties between nations on how they shall trade with each other, they have codes they make. It's called the UCC. Unified Commercial Code has to do with the way incorporated bodies deal with each other. They don't deal with the common man, living woman. No, it's incorporated this to, incorporated that. So they were born, and each one had a constitution. That makes 3. 1 constitution for and 2 constitutions of. I tried to get the Constitution 4 a long time ago and could never get it. I tried and tried and tried, couldn't get it. Then I found out that we had a copy of it. A lord from England had been there when all this was being done and took a copy of our founding documents home, put it in one of those manor house libraries in a vault. His downline inherited the building, got to snooping around in the library, found the vault, found these documents, and offered them to us, written on leather. Beautiful. In poor condition, in that they were very old. We now have copies of that for everybody that joins the assembly because we want you to have these documents in your hands. We want you to have the real documents. Well, we've come down through the building of our country, the fighting for independence, and then we had the War of 1812, which was a continuation. Remember that a lot of British sailors jumped ship during the war, and they found haven in the colonies. And then when it was over with, they went to work, as sailors do, on our merchant marine fleet. And then, of course, England get into it with France again, this time Napoleon. And they decided these people were deserters, so they started stealing our merchant marines off our own vessels and press ganging them into British service against Napoleon. And Madison saw that to be an act of war, and he initiated the War of 1812. And he decided, because Jefferson had been whispering in his ear, that Canadians really do want to be part of us. Getting Canada on our side would be little more than a marching exercise, so the British didn't see it that way, so we had a lot of war on the Great Lakes borders. Maine was really angry at Madison. They thought that the border might change and they might end up being Canadian, so they almost seceded. It was less than 2 years before it was over with, and then they couldn't stop Jackson because he didn't get the word. He's running down the Mississippi and attacking the French, the English down in New Orleans. They didn't have cell phones, couldn't tell him to stop. It was over with. They're trying to sign the papers for Christmas time, and he's down there. It's 1st of January, and Jackson's going. They finally caught up with him and got him shut down, told him to go home. It's over with. He made himself famous over it. I admire his enthusiasm, but timing was bad. At any rate, our country ran like that through to what became known as the Civil War. And then everything went south, literally.